The nuclear bomb is the only weapon that forces world leaders to ask themselves a very strange question before ordering its use. If I press this button, will I in my own country still exist? That question, at once absurd and chilling, has become the foundation of a distorted kind of peace that humanity has lived with for nearly 80 years. Never before in history have great powers been this strong, with arsenals of destruction this vast, and yet not plunged into a third world war. Many scholars call this nuclear peace, a silence held in place by the fear of being wiped out entirely. Instead of relying on reason, morality, or international law, the modern world order leans heavily on a brutal reality. Everyone understands that if they push a conflict too far, they could all die together. So why has the nuclear bomb, the most horrifying weapon human beings have ever created, become the lock that keeps the world from falling into another global war? How has it changed the way great powers think about war? And what is the true price humanity is paying for this so-called peace? To grasp this paradox, we need to go back to the era before nuclear weapons, when war was still seen as an extreme instrument of politics. In the first half of the 20th century, the world went through two world wars that nearly consumed industrial civilization. The First World War turned an entire generation of European young men into names carved on stone monuments, with muddy trenches, poison gas, and piles of bodies that still didn't fundamentally change how people thought about war. The Second World War was even worse. The fighting didn't just stay far away on distant fronts, it poured directly into cities, factories, and the skies above civilians' heads. The firebombing of Dresden, Tokyo, London showed that entire cities could be turned into infernos overnight, and yet generals and politicians still believed that, if necessary, they could endure to the end, sacrifice millions, and eventually the side that held out longer would win. In their minds, there was always a stopping point. One side would run out of strength, the other would win, and the war would end. All of that collapsed in 1945, when a new kind of weapon appeared and smashed that logic to pieces, the atomic bomb. In just a few seconds, a single bomb could erase almost an entire city, killing tens of thousands of people instantly and leaving the survivors with burned bodies, radiation sickness, and lives permanently devastated. For the first time, humanity faced the possibility of destroying not just an army or a region, but an entire people, even an entire civilization, with just a few button presses. At first, the United States was the only country that possessed this weapon, like a new god on the battlefield, but that advantage didn't last long. In the late 1940s, the Soviet Union tested its own nuclear bomb, and the world plunged into a new kind of arms race. It was no longer about who had more tanks or who built more planes, but who had more nuclear warheads, whose missiles could fly farther and faster, who had submarines that could carry nuclear weapons undetected. The balance of power shifted from a balance of forces to a balance of destruction. From this point, a crucial concept emerged: mutual assured destruction, or MAD. It sounds insane, but it is brutally logical. Both sides have enough weapons to obliterate each other many times over. If one side strikes first, the other still has enough warheads to retaliate and turn the attacker into ash. No one can start a war and still hope to emerge intact. If a third world war breaks out between nuclear powers, there will be no victor, only survivors in a shattered world, facing nuclear winter, dead crops, and collapsing societies. That nightmare scenario became the rope binding leaders' hands, preventing them from acting as recklessly as the old European emperors or dictators like Hitler. The nuclear bomb began to act as a very particular kind of lock, not one that locks away guns, but one that locks away the will to pull the trigger, forcing leaders to weigh every step, every threat, every military action. The world entered the Cold War, a period that was intensely tense and yet quiet in the sense that there was no Third World War, The United States and the Soviet Union confronted each other on every front: economics, ideology, space, espionage, propaganda. They fought proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, in Africa and Latin America, supplying weapons, training, and support to opposing sides. But there was one thing they avoided at all costs: letting their official armies fight each other directly on a large scale, because everyone understood that a direct clash between two nuclear superpowers could spiral beyond anyone's control. The more warheads were produced, the more missiles were deployed, the more acutely leaders felt that a small mistake could become the last mistake of all humankind. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the most suffocating moment, when nuclear weapons pulled the world right up to the edge of the cliff and then helped pull it back. When the Soviet Union secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, just a few hundred kilometers from the US coast, Washington was shocked to realize that if war broke out, its major cities could be struck within minutes. The United States ordered a naval blockade, prepared airstrikes, and drew up invasion plans. The whole world held its breath. People in many places started stockpiling food, digging bomb shelters, because doomsday no longer felt like something from a movie. Behind closed doors, generals discussed the option of striking first, spreading blood-soaked scenarios across the table. But the more they calculated, the clearer it became. There was no scenario in which both sides walked away lightly wounded and then simply rebuilt. Once nuclear weapons were used, every model of victory and defeat became meaningless. In the end, compromise prevailed. The Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, and the US quietly removed its missiles from Turkey. The world stepped back exactly one step and avoided falling into the abyss. Not because leaders suddenly became more humane, but because they stared into the true cost of nuclear war and realized it was a bill no one could pay. After that shock, the superpowers started building an entire system to manage their fear: hotlines between capitals so they could talk directly during crises, military doctrines that emphasized deterrence instead of first strikes, arms control treaties aimed at preventing nuclear stockpiles from swelling to a point where any small accident could end everything. Nuclear weapons keep the peace by turning war into a game where the minimum stake is too high. In the old days, two countries might gamble, go to war, accept losses, and hope to be the one still standing at the end. Today, if two nuclear powers face off directly, they are betting not just their armies, but the very survival of their societies. No leader wants to go down in history as the person who erased their own nation. That fear makes large-scale war too risky, like a gamble in which the minimum buy-in is your entire fortune plus your children's future. When the entry price becomes that absurdly high, people start hesitating, backing off, seeking compromise, bargaining, and circling around each other instead of charging straight in. However, the peace that nuclear weapons bring is neither clean nor fair. It is built on the bones of millions who died in proxy wars, where ordinary weapons speak in place of the ultimate ones. When direct war is off the table, great powers export their confrontation to weaker places: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. There, people still kill each other with guns, bombs, landmines, and fighter jets, while above it all floats the shadow of nuclear weapons, ensuring that the fighting will not go beyond a certain threshold. The world avoided a Third World War, but in exchange it has endured countless smaller, long, grinding conflicts that devastate poor and weak regions. The peace of the strong can, at times, simply mean moving the battlefield into someone else's home, so they bear the risk of global escalation instead. On top of that, this nuclear lock is always one step away from breaking. Throughout the Cold War and even after, there have been many times when early warning systems sent false alerts, raiders misread signals, satellites mistook sunlight for missile launches, and humans misinterpreted one another's actions. At certain moments, duty officers had only a few minutes to decide: trust the machines and order a retaliatory strike, or trust their gut feeling that something isn't right. We live in a world where, on several occasions, If just one person had been slightly less calm or slightly less skeptical, they might have turned the key. So far, we've been lucky that these people chose restraint, but nothing guarantees that luck will last forever. The more countries possess nuclear weapons, the more links there are in the chain, the more technical systems, and the more ways something can go wrong. Initially, the nuclear club consisted only of the US and the Soviet Union, then came the UK, France, and China. Later, India, Pakistan, Israel, and more recently North Korea joined in. Each country arrived at the nuclear threshold carrying its own fears, its own enemies, and its own security calculations. Some feel encircled and threatened, so they want nuclear weapons to ensure no one dares invade them. Others see nuclear arms as a ticket to a seat at the top table of world politics, proof of great power status. From their perspective, the bomb is like a protective talisman. A nuclear-armed country is very hard to invade directly or topple from the outside. From a global perspective, though, every new warhead is an additional slice of risk. Risk of accidents, risk of technology leaking, risk of extremist groups trying to seize nuclear materials or even a functional weapon. In that sense, the world becomes safer in one way and more dangerous in another. That is why, alongside accepting the reality that nuclear weapons are in some sense keeping the peace, the international community has tried to bind them in. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was designed to prevent too many countries from joining this game in exchange for promises from the nuclear powers to gradually reduce their massive arsenals. Arms control agreements between the US and the Soviet Union, and later Russia, helped bring warhead numbers down from the tens of thousands to much lower levels. But even after these reductions, what remains is still more than enough to destroy the world many times over. And treaties are not eternal. Some have been abandoned, some ignored, while the great powers continue to modernize their arsenals with hypersonic missiles, smarter guidance systems, and more diverse, harder to intercept delivery platforms. In the 21st century, the global order is no longer just a simple US-Soviet rivalry, but a tangled network. US-Russia tensions, China's rise, the India-Pakistan standoff, North Korean missile tests, and flashpoints from Eastern Europe to East Asia, all haunted by nuclear deterrence in the background. Here, we run into a moral paradox. Humanity is relying on a threat capable of killing hundreds of millions of people to prevent large wars from breaking out. From a strategic perspective, many argue that without nuclear weapons, the world might well have seen a third world war, given that great power rivalry, ideological conflict, and territorial and resource disputes never disappeared. But from a human perspective, the survivors of nuclear bombings, the communities exposed to fallout from nuclear tests, and the regions contaminated by lingering radiation remind us that this is not a harmless insurance policy. Simulations of nuclear winter suggest that even a small fraction of existing nuclear weapons being used could loft enough smoke and ash into the atmosphere to dim the sun, sharply lower global temperatures, wither crops on a massive scale, and leave billions facing starvation. In such a scenario, the question of who won becomes completely meaningless. Today's peace thus resembles a house built on the rim of a volcano. Every day nothing happens is a lucky day, but no one can honestly promise that will always be the case. In the end, when we ask, why has the nuclear bomb preserved the world's peace? We face a hard truth. Nuclear weapons are neither good nor humane. They keep the peace not by making people love each other more, trust each other more, or respect the law more, but by making large-scale war so insane and irrational that even the most ambitious leaders think twice. It is like tying to people to a barrel of explosives, giving each one a match, and saying, if either of you lights it, you both die. In that situation, it's very likely no one dares strike the match, but that's not harmony, it's desperation. Today, we live in a world where those bombs are still in underground bunkers, on submarines, on missiles, just a chain of orders and a few minutes away from being used. Every day they are not activated is another day when nuclear peace remains temporarily in effect. The more important question perhaps, is not just why have nuclear bombs preserved peace so far, but are we willing to live forever in a future where our peace is always hanging by a thread beneath these weapons? The answer, if it comes, will not only depend on politicians and generals, but on how humanity chooses to continue relying on fear, or to dare to build a new, less risky security model before a mistake occurs that none of us can ever undo.